Okay, welcome back, everybody. We are going to continue with our documentary talking about America's eternal fight for freedom and this endless war we seem to be in with dark forces, secret societies, globalists, financial powers, all sorts of evil enemies. And we'll do a recap of what we talked about in the first portion, and then we'll go through our sources. We'll do the sources first. Right here, we got The American Past, Conflicting Interpretations of the Great Issues, Volume 1. This is from the 60s. It's a college textbook, and it's fantastic. It's like truther stuff from the 60s. It's great. We're going to read from A Year in the South. This is a book written from the memoirs of 4 people who actually survived 1865 from like a slave, a housewife, a soldier. Fantastic book. We're going to read The Growth of Industrial Enterprise. This is a book from the 60s. This is important because it talks about who benefited from the war. Then we have a really nice textbook here, The Growth of the American Republic. This one's from the 50s, I think, and we'll be reading out of that. We have sources from the American Republic. This is an old, I think, high school textbook from back in the 60s. I think it was my mom's. 70s maybe, because there's peace signs on it. Then we're going to look at leading constitutional cases, and we're going to see what the federal government, what the courts were doing during war with our own country. And then I got to show you this. This is a modern textbook. First of all, look how skinny it is. I mean, look at this one right, well, you saw it. These things are massive, big books. And then you look at this modern little reader they assign. It's trash. And we're going to look at the table of contents of this because it's super biased, and it's like all about women and slaves. Like the whole thing. Let's start with that. Let's start with a laugh. And you know what? I took women's courses under a professor named Christine D, and they were fantastic courses. She didn't have a political bias. That's why. Like, this stuff's okay if you get the politics out of it. It's ridiculous. Wow, for their little intro, Ancient America. So way back in the day, they do Aristotle on masters and slaves. Okay, this is an interesting book. But, yeah. Let me get to the American part. So, Republicans in power, 1800 to 1824. That's what we talked about the last time, and everything here is about Thomas Jefferson's Indian policy. A slave demands that Thomas Jefferson abolish slavery. Oh my gosh. So yeah, these modern books, plantation rules. Madison Hemmings recalls life as Thomas Jefferson's enslaved son. Fanny Kemble learns about abuses of slave women. Nat Turner explains why he became an insurrectionist. The pro-slavery argument. The anti-slavery constitution. So, they just focus on that. That's it. That's all that happened back then. Don't look into anything else because it was only about slavery. Oh, we're also going to look at, this is an old one, U.S. history and maps. That'll be cool. So you can actually see the extent of, what territory was occupied and fought over during this war. We're also going to look at some online stuff. This is a book we'll be reading out of, written by John Wilkes Booth's sister. And this is such a fascinating truth nugget. It's going to blow your mind. The last name Booth is really Botha. And the Botha family, to this day, are the bloodline that control South Africa. And this is the same Botha family from which the Booth line comes from. John Wilkes Booth, the assassin of Abraham Lincoln. We're going to look at the genealogy behind that. And then we're going to read about the Boer War in South Africa, which was carried out by the Botha presidency, I believe. Not only that, but the Wilkes part of his family comes from this crazy guy, who John Wilkes will be talking about him. He was an Englishman who was pro-colonist. He was pro-independence, but he lived in England. He was an English politician, and the rebellious part of the colonies loved him. But we'll read in the Encyclopedia Britannica that this guy willingly attended black masses. I don't know if you know what a black mass is, but pretty sure that involves sacrifice. Kind of weird. We're going to talk about Bleeding Kansas, Henry Clay, the great negotiator, the Missouri Compromise, the caning of Charles Sumner, wild, and the Erie Canal. And that's where I'll start with the recap. In the last episode, we didn't cover that much time. We only covered from like the end of the 1700s to the 1840s, maybe 50, 60 years of time from the creation of our government until a decade before the Civil War or two. And the two most important things to wrap your head around about that time was the rapid change. We have two major changes: the age of transportation and the market revolution. The age of transportation involved canals, like you see on your screen. This is a 363-mile canal they built in the early 1800s. So you have canals, and you have your horse and carriage roads, your footpaths. Those are turning into turnpikes. They're getting paved. They're putting granite cobblers down, right? They're making roads. So you have canals, roads. You have the advent of locomotion. So now you have trains as well, and you have trolley cars and stuff. And then you have steam-powered engines as well, steamboats. So now you have all these different modes of transportation, and that changed everything. And that's what led to the market revolution. So Continental Congress, Constitution is drafted, the countries began, right? And then War of 1812 happens. And then pretty much after the War of 1812, you have this big age of transportation, this big market revolution. And we read about how during all this, you have the bank wars. So you have Hamiltonians on one side saying we need a central bank, we need to make money out of debt. Like literally in their own words, we need to have a central bank and do credit-based system, blah, blah, blah. And then you had on the other side Jacksonians saying, no, we need hard money, we need coinage. And we went through two central banks during this time. So don't picture this time as peaceful. It wasn't. This time they were going crazy in Congress from the beginning of the country all the way up to the Civil War. They were always in perpetual argument and, sneakily trying to get their agendas done. We went through two central banks. How do you think that impacted the farmer or the regular person? It messed everything up. We have several panics. We have a panic of 1819, I think, and then a panic of 1837, I believe, where everybody rushed to the banks, a run on the banks, tried to get their money out, and the system would crash. So tumultuous times, right? And of course, with all this territory and all this opportunity, speculation becomes a huge part of it. So that's really why they wanted the central bank, so that they could capitalize as quickly as possible on the opportunity that they had. They wanted to industrialize and capitalize as fast as possible. And that would have been the Hamiltonians, and basically the mindset of the aristocracy of the North. On the other hand, you have the Jeffersonians and the Jacksonians who are saying we need hard money. We need a physical currency backed by gold. And, we're not so sure about this rapid industrialization. We don't really want wild speculation on the stock market. We don't want these industries being created so quickly that they don't get regulated, which is eventually what would happen, right? The robber barons. So in the South, things were a little bit different. Like we talked about, the South didn't have that same industrial sentiment. And I can't remember if I mentioned it in this or the take I did before, but the North has terrain and running water everywhere. All over New England, you can find a hill with water, and that is what gave birth to the Industrial Revolution, because that running water can be harnessed for its energy, and that's what gave them the opportunity up there to invent mills and invent steam-powered engines and stuff like that. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that during this time of great transformation, two countries formed. That's just the god-darn truth. Two countries formed. You had the industrial North, which spiritually, religiously was enlightened. The North wasn't very Christian, and I can prove that and will prove that with all the cemeteries I've been to. The North was enlightened. They were, a product of the age of reasoning. So the North, spiritually, was super different than the South. The South was mostly Christian, because if you think about it, slavery is kind of a biblical thing. You have to put yourself in these people's minds. Life was very different back then, okay? Slavery was, in the Bible and stuff. So, yeah, they could make the argument for it down there. But what you got to understand is that we have two vastly different territories forming. And then, of course, there's a third territory, the West, forming, right? As people and product and capital move west. So we have these two differing ideologies that are trying to control the birth of the nation, basically, the westward movement, right? So this was kind of bound to, they're bound to butt heads, the Hamiltonians in the North and the Jacksonian, Jeffersonians in the South. I think I'm definitely more of a Jeffersonian. He was like, we have so much land. Can't we just live simple, live on the land with a simple currency? But no. It seems the devil definitely infested the North. The devil landed in the North with the arrival of Masonry and the Illuminati and all sorts of stuff like that. Okay. I think, speaking of that, we should start with, hold on. We're going to start with the growth of industrial enterprise. This is a good book. We're going a little out of our timeline here. Let me show you this book, actually. So where we left off was basically like the 1840s, but what we're going to talk about here, they go into a little background. This doesn't start necessarily at 1816. They go 1860. They go back a little bit when they talk about the birth of certain industries, right? So we're going to save the Civil War. We're going to skip the Civil War part and the Reconstruction part. And we're just going to read this part about industry. By the way, this was published in 1964. Curriculum Resources Incorporated. So this would have been in somebody's classroom, probably my grandpa's. Okay. Chapter 2, Case Studies in American Development. Industry. What form did America's growth between wars take? What were the causes and effects of this growth? To begin, let us examine a few of the industries that experienced significant change during the period. Although these cases will not tell us all we want to know about the process of growth and structural change, they will, if correctly interpreted, point up many important aspects of these twin processes. So it's going to begin with steel. Before the 1850s, the only way to produce steel was by the costly crucible process. As a result, steel was expensive and its uses limited. In the 1850s, the discoveries of the Bessemer and Kelly solved the problem of carbon content, and the result was a 2/3 drop in steel prices. Steel was now available for rails, structures, machines, and a myriad of other uses. Despite this discovery of the Bessemer process, the American steel industry did not develop overnight. The techniques were new and the risks were high. The demand for steel was there, but someone had to be willing to bear the risk, to sell the steel, and to raise the large amount of necessary finance. So the building of the industry. In Andrew Carnegie, the economy had such a person. Carnegie was particularly well suited to the task. His first job had been with the Pennsylvania Railroad, and he well knew the railroad's need for long-lived heavy-duty rail. Moreover, he had maintained close relations with many of the leaders of the industry. More recently, he had been associated with a number of iron firms in the Pittsburgh area, and with the Keystone Bridge Company. That's a Masonic name for you right there, Keystone. I think Philly's a Keystone State. It's a blatant Masonic reference. Let's continue, though. From the iron firms, he learned something of heavy metal production problems, and from the bridge company of the potential market for structural steel. In addition to his work experience, Carnegie possessed another talent that was to contribute to his success in the new steel industry. He was experienced in bringing together the finance needed to acquire large amounts of capital. He had launched both his iron enterprises and the Keystone Bridge Company by bringing together groups of strangers, each with some money to invest. Although the steel mill was larger than any of his previous ventures, this financial problem was really the same. In 1872, Carnegie launched the Carnegie Steel Corporation. His first mill was the J.E. Thompson, and his first product was steel rails. Gradually, he and his partners expanded their operations to include a number of new plants, some built, some acquired from less successful owners, and a full range of steel products. It's going to go into labor problems. We can skip that. Let's go into competition. Although Carnegie remained the largest firm, others were quick to imitate his success. Within a few years, National American and a host of others had begun to produce steel by the new process. Because of the competitive threat of these new firms, Carnegie could not rest on his laurels. As a result, both Carnegie and his competitors quickly innovated the open hearth furnace, which provided more control over the steel-making process. Within a few years, the Bessemer furnace that had given birth to the industry was neglected to a secondary position. In 1872, when Carnegie started in business, the steel industry had produced only a few thousand tons. By 1887, production was almost 6 million tons. And at the turn of the century, output had risen to almost 25 million tons. We can actually look at a graph of that steel production. So that's 1867 to 1920. And what should stick out to you is that first year, 1867. What had just happened in the country? Well, the Civil War. So the Civil War is very important. It plays such a big role in everything that comes afterwards. It can't be just slavery. It's not just slavery. Come on. It's not slavery, okay? They just want you. Do you think the Democrats today actually care about black people? Come on. It wasn't about slavery back then. You know what I mean? Look at that graph. Oh, we just ended a war, and then boom. Money. The North. Okay, the birth of U.S. steel. And this happened with several industries, all right? Many. But the story of steel was not yet finished. The capital requirements, always large, had increased with the adoption of the open hearth techniques. Moreover, Carnegie and some of the industry's other leaders saw that even more financial resources would be needed to acquire iron in coal mines. If the firm's source of supply were to be protected, John Rockefeller had gained control of a large portion of the Mesabi Iron Range in Minnesota, and he showed the industry the value of its raw materials. Carnegie had been able to finance some of this additional investment, but many of the other firms could not. J.P. Morgan, the financier, saw in this shortage a chance to put together a single firm. It was to embrace all phases of production: mines, railroads, shipping lines, blast furnaces, steel mills, and fabricating plants. It produced not only rails and structural steel, but wire, tubing, and the new alloys as well. Carnegie's retirement gave Morgan the chance to bring together not only Carnegie's holdings, but also Rockefeller's iron mines, Federal Steel. So those are the characters we're talking about: Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, Morgan. These people, it sounds cliche, I know, but we live in a society that has been created by that group of people. Rockefeller institutions, John Hopkins, the Gates Foundation. Look where all these families got their starts. Most of them started after the Civil War. After every war is how these families gain more power. It's like we read Smedley P. Butler's book, War is a Racket, and he outlines it so perfectly in that book. You should download it. It's free. And he outlines how people made unbelievable amounts of money off World War I, and the government was in on it. For example, he goes example after example in his book, and he says, like, gas masks. So in 1918, at the very end of the war, the U.S. government ordered $40 million worth of gas masks. Not one of them got shipped over. Stuff like that. And where in the $40 million is pocketed. Taxpayer money. And the people who sit on the boards of the company that make gas masks are close to the lobbyist in Congress, and they're all just friends with each other, right? So really, the first Civil War is like an enormous racket for a lot of people, for a lot of the industries that still dominate today, right? Okay. Let's read the impact of steel on the economy. Nor does the story end with the steel firms themselves. The impact of Carnegie, Morgan, and the others was felt in all parts of the economy. In 1860, the size of the machines was limited by the strength of their wooden or cast iron components. By 1900, the day of the wooden machine had passed. There were practically no size limits on those of the new steel. The railroads of 1860 had used iron rails, but these rails limited the size of the rolling stock to about 8 tons and wore out in about 2 to 3 years. By 1905, the steel rails carried cars of 70 tons and lasted up to 10 years. In almost every large city, new high-rise buildings were pushing their way skyward. As long as the main structural material had been wood, building height could not exceed 5 or 6 stories. With steel, however, skyscrapers, the Woodworth, the Flatiron buildings, to name 2, of over 50 stories were built. So you got to think, this small handful of enlightened, profitable financiers and industry leaders, these barons, they would be called, right? These barons, now all of a sudden, after this war, they're capable of building skyscrapers, building, trains, building huge steel factories. So much change. Blows the previous age of transportation and the market revolution out of the water. Something much bigger is happening. Somebody benefited immensely from the war, and it was this group of people, these powerful men that History Channel makes shows about. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies. I think the Astors and the DuPonts were World War I. Vanderbilts, Carnegies, Morgans, Rockefellers. Unbelievable. So we got a section about petroleum here. Let's see what it says. Wow. Yeah, this will be good. Refineries. Okay. Once pumped, the oil still had to be refined. The technique... I forgot what I was saying. But what I mean is now they can build all these giant cities and all these skyscrapers. Well, how are we going to get people to do the actual work? How are we going to get people... Because you can't keep building an empire without a populace. Anybody who's played a strategy video game knows that. You need population to support the empire. And they were running out of labor. Actually, I skipped the section, but it says in this book that around the time of the post-Reconstruction Civil War era, they couldn't find people to do the work. Or even beforehand, they couldn't find people to do the work. Now I got to check. I think it's beforehand because that's important. And what that means is, what better way to get people to fill those factories than to just completely decimate half of the country so that they all have to migrate north because there's no opportunity. You destroyed everything. You destroyed the economy down there. And what's the best way to infiltrate and destroy half of the country's economy? Slavery, of course. Just like they're infiltrating ours today. They use race. Wow, I think we're figuring out the truth about the Civil War. I think the South might have been the righteous side. Wow. I'm calling it the war of northern aggression from now on. That's crazy, dude. I'm not going to waste time looking for this. But they couldn't fill the factories, so what better way than to decimate the South and force all those people to migrate north to the cities, especially the black people. That's how racist they are. They are so racist. They looked at the South and said, we need those slaves. So they said, this is what we're going to do. We are going to go to war with the South and tell the people it's over slavery because we're going to tell them that slavery is evil. Once we destroy the South with our military, we will take over the economy, open up all of our factories, build skyscrapers, build factories, and by the time we've rebuilt the South, all of them will have migrated north with our help to fill our factories. That's how racist they are. That's how racist Freemasons are. Holy crap. Crazy. Let's read about refineries. Once pumped, the oil still had to be refined. The techniques had been well developed in the production of coal oil, and it was not long before many simple refineries were producing a series of petroleum derivatives. It was, however, in the middleweight distilleries, such as kerosene, that the profits were to be earned. Kerosene revolutionized the illumination field and continued to be the major source of illumination for rural areas long after gas and electricity replaced it in cities. In its early days, the industry consisted of a multitude of small producers selling to about the same number of small refiners. The refiners used their crude oil stills to produce kerosene, which they attempted to market in the East and abroad. As production increased, transport became a serious problem, and capital became even more of a problem than it had been before. The new refining techniques required a large and expensive plant. So that's a theme we've talked about over and over. There's not enough money, right? So early refineries consisting of a metal still and a few hundred feet of cooling coil seldom represented an investment of over $400. By 1880, however, a typical refinery cost close to $300,000, and by 1900, the figure was $1,300,000. Wow, that's pretty crazy. Okay, such demands put serious pressure on an industry that had been unable to raise the price of a railroad ticket from New Haven to Titusville. The need for better transport. Oil is a bulky commodity, and cheap transport was needed in the industry if the industry was to succeed. In 1863, the price of illumination oil was 36 cents a gallon, and at that price, almost any transport charge could be absorbed. By 1885, however, because of technological developments in the opening of new fields, the price had fallen to 8 cents, and the industry could no longer tolerate high transport costs. At the same time, their demands for transport were increasing as output rose from a few 100,000 barrels in 1860 to 18 million barrels 15 years later. Wow, guys. I hope you're getting the same implications that I'm getting out of this. So, 36 cents a gallon in 1863 during the war for this oil. Now, they tell you that the South only had cotton. You know, that's all they could make. But the South has all the oil, like Texas, right? Parts of the South, that's where they were making kerosene. Southwest, well, not all the way Southwest during those days, right? That's where they were making kerosene, and they were making a living off of it, 36 cents a gallon, so they could transport it and not have to worry. They could sell it to the North. But by 1885, that kerosene had fallen to 8 cents. The oil didn't disappear. The oil's still all in the South. Well, you're going to find out why in the next paragraph, but take a look at this old distillery. What does it look like to you? An obelisk. Okay, one sec. Rockefeller and Standard Oil. The profits were there for the man who could solve the twin problems of transport and capital. John D. Rockefeller was such a man. Rockefeller had begun his business career as a wholesale merchant in Cleveland, one of the leading oil refining centers. He centered the industry as a partner in a small refinery just at the time that the new refining techniques were being developed, and the industry was pressed for funds. Firms that could afford the new equipment were able to produce more cheaply than those that could not, and as the price of kerosene fell, those who could not compete were forced out. I love how they try to paint it like this happens naturally. Just one guy just monopolizes all oil. In this struggle, Rockefeller's firm had a distinct advantage. Over the years, Rockefeller had established very close contacts with the Cleveland banking community, and at a time when the banks thought oil loans too risky, they were more than willing to lend to Rockefeller. Wow. So that's collusion. The banks would only lend to Rockefeller for the same investment that other people were asking for, qualified people would ask for. Like, that's what happened. And all this happened as a result of the Confederacy being destroyed. So think about it. You have pre-Civil War, you at least have a split Congress, right? You at least have all these representatives in the federal government who are fighting for you as bad as it gets, kind of like today, right? But when they seceded and got defeated, now the federal government is literally just union. Like, you got to understand, Reconstruction broke the South into military zones. The war wasn't officially done. They were occupied military Reconstruction zones. So the federal government after the war was completely northeastern, enlightened, you know what, Freemasonic, ecumenical, globalist, central bankers. How do you think these handful of people just became so powerful that they literally control the publishing of every school book today? Like Texas Instruments, right? The Rockefeller Foundation too. Literally, all these university textbooks, these are all controlled by publishing companies owned by these original, powerful, post-Civil War, evil families. Wow. So yeah, they're saying Rockefeller's advantage was he was friends with the banks. Classic. Unbelievable. Let me pull out the map book. want to take a look at what the Civil War looked like. This is cool. I love these old books in color. Okay, hold on here. Free states, free territories, seceded. Okay. My books are falling. Can you see that? I will read you the legend in a second. Just know that. Just take note of that big peninsula of like orange yellow going up north, right? So when you look at that, it kind of looks like a battle of the Bulge, right? Let's see what the legend says. It says the purple are the free states at the outbreak of the war. So this green stuff are slave areas. Okay, so the South was pretty big. The green is the South too. The purple is the Union at the top. Okay, South is pretty big. And then let's see what the orange and yellow are. So area of Confederate military control is the purple. I mean, not the purple, I'm sorry, the orange. Confederate military control at the time of March 1st, 1865. So that orange was all that they had left at the end of it. Think about that, fellow countrymen. And everything outside of that orange blob was razed to the ground. The Old South was burned. You don't think the Union soldiers burned down cities and raped people and killed kids? They absolutely did, because that's what happens in every war. Every single war. Nobody can deny that. There is no war where, well, nowadays, there used to be honor in war, but there's no war nowadays where stuff like that doesn't happen. And countrymen were doing that to their countrymen. Pretty crazy. Okay. What could drive them to do that to their countrymen? Propaganda. Propaganda. So let's read from A Year in the South. 1865, the true story of 4 ordinary people who lived through the most tumultuous 12 months in American history. By Stephen Ash. So I want to do this so we can, put ourselves in the shoes of somebody actually in the South, because you never learn anything about the South because the stupid schools never teach anything about it. So we're going to learn about a slave named Louis Hughes. One sec. All right, this is the story of Louis Hughes. South Alabamians sometimes call it simply the Bigbee. It is a short name for a long river that rolls lazily, with many twists and turns southward from the heart of the state to Mobile on the Gulf Coast. In early 1865, the Tombigbee was high and busy with steamboats. Remember we talked about steamboats? They chugged up and down the river between Demopolis and Mobile, stopping at landings here and there to load or unload. Bales of cotton and piles of Osnaburg snacks crowded the docks with many of the boats. The sacks held the more precious cargo. They were filled with salt. Okay, sorry, it's hard to read. Small words. Many of the sacks were marked Alabama. These were loaded aboard at a stop on the east bank of the river in Clark County, some 60 miles north of Mobile. A road led inland from the landing there, and a short distance up that road lay the Alabama Salt Works. It was a sprawling little settlement centered around a large wooden building with a veranda. The building was the headquarters in which Louis Hughes lived and worked. Lou, as he was used to being called, had stepped easily into his new situation when he came to the works in 1863. A well-trained butler was a prized and useful servant, and thus Lou was immediately singled out from the other leased slaves, and set to work in that role. He did a good job and became a favorite of the state salt commissioner, Benjamin Woolsey, whose office was in the headquarters. Matilda, Lou's wife, was put to work as a cook. She too won the commissioner's approval. Her bread and rolls, he said, were as good as any he had ever tasted. Hold on a second. Shouldn't they be tying these slaves up and whipping them? Excuse me. That's not what happened. No, you see what this is? You see, they totally painted the South as something that it wasn't. So instead of this guy whipping and raping this woman, he's saying, you know what? This bread and these rolls are the best I've ever tasted. So maybe slavery wasn't exactly what they want you to think it was. Maybe we should stop using slavery and start using indentured servitude, and we should stop dividing it between blacks and whites. Why are white people called indentured servitudes in the history books, and why are black people called slaves when there was no difference with what they went through? For real. So I'm just going to call them indentured servitude because it says right here they're leased slaves. Leased slave. They are indentured servants. Slavery is awful, don't get me wrong, but to think that every white person hated every black person and that every slave was, living in a shack, no. It's unbelievable. Let's continue. Wolseley, a lawyer and planter by profession, had at one time offered to buy Lou and Matilda for $3,000, but Boss had turned him down. Boss was dead now, of course. January 1st, 1865 was the first anniversary of his death. His sudden passing had shocked his family and slaves, but resulted in no immediate changes for Lou and Matilda. They and the other McGee slaves stayed on the salt works by order of the Madam Boss's widow, who remained at her father's plantation in Mississippi. There were many slaves at the works in early 1865, perhaps 200 or more. Their muscle and sweat and skills powered an extensive manufacturing operation. Let's read that again slowly. There were 200 or more. Their muscle and sweat and skills powered an extensive manufacturing operation. I thought they weren't taught to read. I thought they were just picking cotton and doing dumb stuff because the white people were so racist that they didn't teach black people any skills. I thought they didn't teach them skills on purpose, but that's not true. Apparently, these slaves are running an extensive manufacturing operation. Salt was literally the most important commodity during the war and for the South. And so keep that in mind. Like, they were educated often. It's not what they're telling you. Okay. It was a scene of almost constant activity, for there were all sorts of tasks to be done, and the Confederacy's salt famine generated a sense of urgency. Slave men did most of the heavy labor, boring wells, tending pumps and furnaces, chopping and hauling wood, making bricks, building levees, sacking and weighing and loading the salt. The slave women cooked and did laundry and other chores, with the help of the older children. Whites did the other jobs, among the 24 or so employed at the works. Besides the salt commissioner were a superintendent, a clerk, a bookkeeper, a commissionary manager, a doctor, a wagon master, 2 steam engine operators, several artisans, and a number of overseers. The salt works was not just a manufacturing operation, but a community, and a largely self-sustaining one. All the people who worked there lived on the site. Most of the slaves resided in barracks or cabins that were spaced neatly along a street. The whites had separate residences or took rooms upstairs at the headquarters. Like any respectable southern village, the works had a smithy, a cooperage, a shoemaking shop, a carpentry shop, a sawmill, a gristmill, and a cemetery. Who do you think's doing all that skilled labor? It also boasted a hospital, a commissary, a sack-making shop, a storehouse, and at least one kitchen. The works produced no grain or meat. These were purchased from outside sources, but it had a dairy and a 7-acre vegetable garden that helped feed the whole community. Like any village, too, the works had its own economy, an informal system of borrowing and bartering, swapping and selling. Slaves as well as whites engaged in this casual commerce, and Lew Hughes was one of those clever enough to make money from it. Wait a second. They didn't let black people buy or sell anything. They were slaves. Now, you see, that's not true here. And this Louis Hugh, this black guy, even makes money off the white guys. So you're starting to see, it's like it says right here, like any village, it had its own informal system of borrowing, bartering. Slaves as well as whites engaged in casual commerce. So when you think slavery, it's okay to think of them coexisting. You know what I mean? I don't picture a slave and a white person talking about race all the time in the South. That wasn't it. These people coexisted in a system that benefited everybody because slavery was a reality. Yes, slavery is awful, but slavery had been transformed into something that's not slavery. The South was doing something different. In some cases, yeah, it was bad, obviously, but the South was trying to transition their economy into something different than the North. We're trying to find out. Okay, hold on. Where were we? As Lou tells it, one day in the early part of 1865, he approached the superintendent of the works, N.S. Brooks, about getting some tobacco. He had $100 he had borrowed from 3 other slaves they had earned in doing extra chores at the works in their free time. Lou wanted this tobacco not to smoke but to resell. Brooks, like Lou, was happy to do him a favor, so he took the money and dispatched an order by boat to a merchant in Mobile. 4 days later, a package containing 36 plugs of tobacco arrived. Wait a second, so this black guy was able to make $100 off of everybody, and then he asked the superintendent, shouldn't the superintendent be whipping him? Like, that's what the television tells me. But no, the superintendent was like, I can get you what you need. It's just going to take 4 days and a boat trip to Mobile. It's a whole different vibe. Okay. Brooks turned it over to Lou, who, after finishing his morning duties at headquarters, set out to peddle the plugs among the black laborers at the works. Within an hour, he had sold every plug at $5 apiece, for a profit of $80. Later, as Lou was serving the noon meal in his headquarters dining room, Brooks asked him how he had done with the tobacco. I did very well, Lou replied. The only trouble was I did not have enough. Brooks questioned him a little more, then drew out a pencil and paper and did some figuring. His own salary was a meager $150 a month in rapidly depreciating Confederate money. After the meal, while Lou was clearing the table, so he's getting paid. The slave is getting paid. Interesting. Brooks came in from the veranda where he had been smoking with the clerk and made a proposition. He would order all the tobacco Lou could sell if Lou could split the profit with him 50-50. Lou agreed. And this is an important thing to read because you can just clearly see that both of these guys, white and black, are putting money over their race without even questioning it, right? Brooks ordered another shipment that day, 500 plugs. When it came, Lou went into business in earnest. He recruited 3 other slaves as gents and gave them some plugs on consignment. The 3 were William, who was a foreman of the wood chopping detail, Uncle Hudson, who cared for the horses and mules, and John, who worked at the hospital. Every 2 or 3 days, each would turn in his proceeds and take some more plugs. Meanwhile, whenever Lou had any free time following his afternoon chores, he would saddle up the old pony and, with Brooks' blessing, ride around through the neighborhood surrounding the works and sell more plugs. The other slaves were curious about the source of the tobacco, but Lou kept it a secret. In 2 weeks, we had taken in $1,600, he recalled, and I was happy as I could be. Brooks was a fine fellow, a northerner by birth, and did just what he said he would. I received 1/2 of the money. Of course, this was all rebel money, but I was sharp and bought up all the silver I could find. It must be said that few other slaves in the Old South were as successful in this respect as Lou. He had a privileged position at the works, thanks to the special skills and his close relationship with the superintendent and Commissioner Wolseley. Certainly Uncle Hudson, William, John, and even Matilda, for that matter, enjoyed no such liberties, not to mention the legions of others who did the salt works' daily drudgery with axe and spade. Before the war, 33 pounds of salt could have been bought anywhere in the South for less than 50 cents. But by 1862, it cost $13, and it was sometimes hard to find even at that price. I might have skipped a page. I think I did skip a page. Bear with me. Okay, the slaves at the works labored 6 days a week. Most of them, as was customary in the South, worked from sunup to sundown. Those who tended the furnaces, however, had to work in shifts both day and night. For the furnaces were kept going around the clocks every day except Sunday, when all work ceased, because most of the jobs at the salt works required very heavy labor. Brooks and Wolseley, who shared responsibility for managing the works, preferred to lease adult male slaves. They paid the slave owners not in cash but in kind, 4 bushels, about 200 pounds of salt per month, for an able-bodied male hand. The payment for women and children was less, and while Brooks and Wolseley would accept any healthy slave sent to them, they encouraged owners to send only men. Okay, so what I'm trying to take out of this and trying to explain is that slavery isn't good, obviously, and no forms of slavery should exist, but when it comes to the Civil War, this is what the North was doing. Like I said, they were using slavery to convince the public of going to war with their own country, the South. Because after they did that, they were able to open up their economy and have all these robber barons in all these industries and have this great industrial revolution, this was a result of the Civil War. And then all those people whose lives were destroyed in the South, especially the freed black people, they were all encouraged north. That's literally what happened. And they became slaves in a whole different way. Think about it. What would you rather do? Would you rather chop a tree down for no money? Or would you rather work 16 hours in a dark factory for no money? Because that's what happened. They all became slaves in the factories. White people too. That's literally what happened after the Civil War. And oftentimes the factory owned the property where the slaves lived. Is that different? Is that not slavery? The factory owns your house. You literally work 16 hours a day. You have no insurance. You don't make enough money to do anything except live. They just give you the illusion because you get to go to the market and choose between 5 different meats. You're still a slave, right? And it was the same way in the South. The slaves could have money, clearly. We're reading about this one making $1,600 in a week. The slaves could have money. They could have all the same things a white person working in a factory in the North would get. Literally the same life. Both forms of slavery. And the North knew that. That was the whole point. So the war is not what they say it is. They say it was fought because of enlightened, humanistic. No, such a lie. Such a lie. It was... The Civil War was fought so that the North could create the plantations of the future. You can quote me on that. That's a good one. The North wanted to create the plantations of the future. True. Fact. What else we got in here? Might come back to this. This is a good book. Definitely a good book. Samuel Agnew. Let's read about Samuel Agnew. Early on New Year's Day in 1865, in the southeastern corner of Tippah County, Mississippi, word spread that the Yankees were coming. The citizens of the community had heard such rumors dozens of times over the last 3 years. More often than not, these alarms proved false. But no one was willing to gamble on this one. Men and women scurried to hide their valuables and carry the news to their neighbors, shattering the stillness of this clear, cold Sunday morning. Why would they have to hide their valuables if the enlightened Union Army is just there to free slaves, right? When the report reached the Agnew plantation, Sam Agnew knew what to do. The 31-year-old minister and his family were veterans of many Yankee alarms. With the help of their slaves, Sam and his father rounded up the mules and cattle and headed for a patch of woods 1.5 miles away, beyond the fields that lay waiting for the plows and harrows of spring. The woods of Tippah County were dense with pine and oak. In many places, there was a thick undergrowth of blackjack, too. Even in the leafless winter, men and livestock could safely hide from Yankee scouts. Sam had an appointment to preach that day at the home of the family named Corder, but now he wondered if he should risk going. It was dangerous for a man to be accosted by the Yankees, even a non-combatant like Sam. Federal raiding parties sometimes took men away to prisons on suspicion of being guerrillas, or simply to keep them out of the hands of the rebel army's conscription agents. So you hear what the North is doing? They're riding around their horses down south, picking people out of their homes, putting them in jail for no reason. Yeah, they sound very enlightened. Sam and his father, Enoch, always camped out in the woods with their animals during Yankee alarms, taking shelter in a tent made of quilts. Because the enemy soldiers did not, as a rule, bother women and children, the rest of the Agnew family, Sam's mother, his teenage siblings and wife, would usually stay at home and summon Sam and Enoch when the scare was over. Damn, that sucks. That morning's report put the Yankees just this side of Ripley, the county seat, which was about 15 miles northwest of the Agnew plantation. The Corder home was in the opposite direction, so Sam decided to take a chance and go. There he found a respectable congregation, as he later noted in his diary, meaning a good-sized one. The rumor of a Yankee raid had not, he learned, reached the neighborhood. Of course, a respectable congregation those days was considerably smaller than what had been used to before the war, and with so many men away in the army or dead. Sam preached from Philippians 2:23, where Paul speaks of his faithful assistant Timotheus. Quote, Him, therefore, I hope to send presently, as soon as I shall see how it will go with me." End quote. Afterward, he mounted up and headed back towards a plantation. So you have to understand, guys, a lot of slaveholders, like, it's a very confusing situation. So you have this guy like Samuel Agnew, right? He knows all about being a slave. Christians were slaves. We were slaves in Israel. So do you really think the relationship he has being a Christian preacher with his slaves is negative? Do you think they live as slaves, really? Or do you think these people live in a mutual agreement with one another, right? It's a weird situation, right? On the books, yeah, they're slaves, and that's awful. But, in the community, it played out a lot different. And you can't forget, like we were saying, the North was pro-slavery as well. You better believe it. They just had the plantations of the future. Ugh. I would totally, think about it. We'll have to keep reading. We gotta keep learning. Okay. Sam wrote in his diary that night, as usual, just before going to bed. He began with prayer. January 1st, New Year's Day, Sabbath. In the good providence of God, I am allowed to enter another year. May God guide and bless me and mine this year. In the weeks that followed, there were signs that God had indeed blessed Sam and his family, at least in one respect. Unlike a lot of other Tippah Countyans, the Agnews were able to procure enough food to get them through the winter, although the devastating Yankee raid in June 1864 had stripped them of every ounce of stored provisions. It had not left them destitute. So you got Yankees riding around on horses, taking everybody's food before winter. Assholes. They had managed to hide their beef cattle and work animals before the Yankees arrived. The hogs were already safe in the woods, for they roamed free until fattening time in the fall. The growing crops, corn, wheat, and cotton, had suffered some damage in the battle that raged across the plantation, but were mostly unharmed, and the same was true of the garden vegetables. A good deal of fencing had been torn down, but Sam's father immediately put the slaves to work rebuilding it, so the livestock and wildlife could not invade the fields and garden. The harvest that fall was not bountiful, but it was sufficient. Once the harvesting was finished, all the hands worked to convert the crops and livestock into food for the table. The corn was shucked and, along with the threshed wheat, hauled to a miller for grinding. The cotton was ginned and baled, and then stored until it could be sold or traded for food and other necessities. Because beef was hard to preserve, the Agnews generally slaughtered steers individually as needed. Pork was another matter, however. They were accustomed to laying in a year's supply after rounding up and fattening the hogs, and that required two things: cold weather and salt. The Confederacy's salt shortage had plagued farmers in Tippah since the war began, but this winter there was some relief. Mississippi state authorities had procured a large supply from the salt works in South Alabama and made it available for purchase or trade at various depots. So here's where the two lives connect, right? So we were just reading about Louis Hughes, the slave who was working at the Alabama salt works. Well, that salt just made its way to Mississippi, where Samuel Agnew is able to preserve his beef with it. Okay. On December 15th, Enoch dispatched a wagon to Guntown, a station on the Mobile, Ohio Railroad 9 miles away. The wagon carried 404 pounds of flour. It returned with 195 pounds of salt. 5 days later, after a cold snap set in, Enoch and the blacks began the process of slaughtering, butchering, salting, and packing. Sam joined in, this being one of the few plantation tasks for which he was needed. They killed 15 hogs that day, hurrying to preserve the meat before the temperature rose. More cool weather on January 5th brought an opportunity to kill another 7. The Agnews were among the fortunate, for many in Tippah had been hit harder than they by the Yankees and now faced a winter of hunger. Think about that, man. Imagine people from New York City coming to where you live, stealing everything and leaving you with nothing for the winter, and everybody starving and dying. That's what happened. Yankees suck. Oh, it's sad. When the tax collector came to their home in early February and demanded his tithe, they grew concerned. "This tax in kind bears hard on us," Sam wrote. "We have no corn or wheat to spare." Tax collectors and Yankee raiders were not the only ones scouring the area for provisions. The rebel army's impressment officers were also active. Yeah, conscription officers. So you get a sense, this is a great book, you get a sense of what was going on back then and how life was for people. And it seems like the excuse of going to war to free the slaves does not outweigh the reality of what they did and what was to happen after the war. That's my personal opinion, because so many people suffered, and the South has just always been painted in such a terrible, evil, evil light. But the truth is, it wasn't like that. It was something different, and we're trying to figure out what that was. Let's see what we got here. I was thinking about reading from this. Civil War. Lincoln's election. Immediate menace to slavery in the States. I want to see if I can find anything good in this one. The conflicting issues. Okay, cool. We'll wait on that. All right, we are going to take a short break, but then we'll read from The Growth of the American Republic. It's going to be a good one. Okay, we're back. So, what we've established thus far is that before the Civil War, it definitely seemed like two nations were forming, and perhaps that's what should have happened, but who knows. But yeah, we have these two very different nations getting to this point where a kinetic conflict is pretty much inevitable, and we see that one side, the North, obviously wins and benefits extremely from it. Interesting. So let's read. We're going to be reading out of this old college textbook here. It's a part called The Aftermath of the War. And after a couple more of these, we're going to get into the events that actually sparked it off, right? Okay. Let's see. James Russell Lowell at the Harvard commemoration service of 1865 saluted, as he believed, a reunited nation purged by war of all grossness that had accompanied its rise to power. But the fierce passions of warfare had burned good with evil, and in the scorched soil the new growth showed more tares than wheat. Lowell was, in fact, delivering a swan song of the New England intellectuals and reformers. The Masons. In the generation to come, that region would no longer furnish the nation with reformers and men of letters, but with a mongrel breed of politicians, sired by abolition out of profiteering. Industry and commerce had the Middle States firmly in their grasp and were extending tentacles throughout the Middle West. The old simplicity and idealism retreated beyond the Mississippi, and materialism soon overtook them there. Wow, do you think the Northeast would ever write anything like that about themselves? So true. The war had been fought for the preservation of the Union, yet this was not the sole object of the war. The nation whose endurance was to be tested was, as Lincoln said in the Gettysburg Address, a nation conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. After 1862, the abolition of slavery came to be a second acknowledged objective of the war. And to many people in Europe, as in America, the maintenance of a government of the people, by the people, for the people, came to be a third. Union, freedom, and democracy. These things were legitimate objectives of... Flipping a page. Hit pause on accident. These were legitimate objectives of the war, and it is proper to inquire to what extent they were achieved and at what cost. Union had been preserved, but it could not be said that the old Union had been restored. The long dispute over the nature of the Union had been settled, at last, in favor of the nationalist contention. So the nationalist won, the federalist won, the Hamiltonians won, right? But the settlement had been brought about by force. Soon it was to be sanctioned by constitutional guarantees and accepted by common consent. And what he's talking about there is the nationalist contention. So the idea that we are all subservient to this federal government, this idea became solidified by force with the Civil War, right? The Civil War was the first, was a giant exercise in government power, right? So it really, the federal government came out of its shell during the Civil War, of course, and didn't work out for all the aspects of the Constitution. But anyway, he's saying that first it was done by military force, then it was sanctioned by constitutional guarantees. So all these rights we have on paper, right? And then it just became accepted by common consent, and now we just consent to it. And once we talk about the Act of 1871, what we consent to is pretty ridiculous. Hold on, the cat first wouldn't leave my room, and now that I started, he wants to leave. Classic Sebastian. Come on. Sebastian, go. Go. Nice, he went. Yeah, okay, let's keep reading. This is good. Yes. Nor had sectionalism disappeared. The natural influences of geography and climate, which had gone to create northern and southern sectionalism, remained, and in the generation after the war, a third powerful section came into existence, the Trans-Mississippi West, whose regional consciousness, like that of the South, was accentuated by its politico-economic exploitation by the Northeast. Until the turn of the century, American life was conditioned by this tripartite sectional division of North, South, and West. And what stands out to me is the politico-economic exploitation by the Northeast. The Hamiltonians, the Freemasons, the intellectuals, the aristocracy. Slavery, to be sure, was gone, and no more would politicians proclaim the sophistry that black servitude was necessary for white freedom. But emancipation, too, had been brought about by violence, rather than by reason or by natural law. Perhaps this was the only way it could have been brought about. But even the most ardent champions of freedom were forced to admit that the method was painful for white and black alike. Emancipation ended slavery, and that was a monumentous thing. But it did not solve the Negro problem. For slavery, it substituted not freedom, but a kind of peonage. And though in a weird metamorphosis of race relations that followed, apodematics, the Negroes did have some voice in their own destiny. For the most part, they merely obeyed new masters. Not for another 100 years were Negroes to enjoy even in part those rights which the war and the new constitutional amendments had attempted to assure them. So yeah, it wasn't even that generation that truly freed the slaves, right? It would have to come later. And what shall we say of the third objective? Government of, by, and for the people. Democracy, indeed, had not perished from the earth. Yet for a decade to come, the essentials of self-government were denied to the South, and Americans witnessed what they had never known before, military government in time of peace. Think about that, guys. Military government in time of peace. They didn't just subdue an uprising in the South. They murdered a nation, a sovereign nation. That's what the Confederacy was. It was a sovereign nation. Imagine if Texas is talking about seceding. What if they actually secede? And what if the federal government wipes them off the face of the earth? That's what we're talking about here in this book. Okay. The Civil War had destroyed slavery and the slaveholding class, but within a few years it strengthened corporate industry and sharpened class dissensions in the victorious North. Wow. Such an important line. And it reminds me of... I can quote this from Christine D., my professor at Fitchburg State. It just stuck with me when she said it. She said 75% of people in the South did not own slaves. Okay. 25% of the people in the South did own slaves. Well, 95% of that 25% had two or less. So a tiny, tiny, tiny fraction of the people in the South had more than two slaves, right? And for the rest of the people, the vast majority, white people, lived in the same way that the slaves lived, depending on what what their circumstances were. So when you looked across a plantation field, it wasn't just black people, right? There were indentured servants, poor white people. And so basically what the war did was, at the expense of the lower class, it eliminated that slaveholding class. Those people who were already an aristocracy in the Confederacy. Like the average Southern person looked at that slaveholding class as snotty. They probably called them Yankees, right? There was already a division between the aristocratic, antebellum, slaveholding top part of the social structure and then the vast majority of the other people who were lumped in with slaves, servants, all sorts of stuff. So yeah, and he's saying once the North destroyed the slaveholding class, it only strengthened corporate industry and sharpened class dissensions in the victorious North. And that is exactly what I was just saying. The Civil War created this military occupation of the South that encouraged all these freed black people to go north to start working in factories. What do you think the real purpose of abolition was? That was the enlightened, northeastern, educated, aristocratic, Freemasonic, ecumenical philosophy of the Northeast. That was the whole point of abolition, was to free these slaves from their owners so they can come up here and work for us. And it happened immediately after the war. That's what this author's saying. 20 years after the attack on Fort Sumter, the railroads alone represented a greater investment in concentration of power than had ever the slave interest, and their influence in politics and in the economic activities of free men were scarcely far less reaching. The Civil War may have advanced democracy in the South because their slavery was destroyed and almost everyone reduced to a uniform poverty, but in the North and the West it furnished an opportunity for the development of powerful industrial and financial interest with which democracy had to grapple, as it had with slavery. As early as 1873, Walt Whitman, apostle of democracy, looked out upon democratic vistas and was moved to writing to a solemn warning. Before we read Walt Whitman's warning, wow, dude. We traded in that form of slavery for this modern form of slavery, which just encompasses all of us. It's crazy, right? And, wow. It says here that it reduced everybody in the South to a uniform poverty, right? So everybody's survival depended on the North. These people are so evil. They've controlled our country a lot. We've never had a moment without their influence in one way or another, whether it's the central banks or it's Civil War. Okay, let's read this little excerpt from Walt Whitman's Democratic Vistas. If you don't know who Walt Whitman was, he traveled the country on foot and wrote poetry, but it was like man's poetry. Poetry was different back then, you know what I mean? He was kind of like a train-hopping hermit, wise man, you know what I mean? He was cool. Shift and turn the combinations of the statement as we may. The problem of the future of America is in certain respects as dark as it is vast. Pride, competition, segregation, vicious willfulness, and license beyond example brood already upon us. Let's pause there. So he's saying in the beginning that he's foreshadowing a very dark future, and I like how very first he lists pride and competition. I mean, that's literally become the tenets of modern society. Pride and competition. You know, who's the best? I'm the best. Segregation, vicious willfulness. Vicious willfulness. It's like the things people get into and invent and create in our society are just mind-boggling. Like, especially the crazy masks now, but we won't get into that. But all the junk, all the materialistic junk. People are just willful to make it, to try to make money. And license beyond example. They're just able to do whatever they want, especially in New England. It's where, have you seen what Boston Dynamics has been doing? That's a great example. That is a great example of vicious willfulness and license beyond example, is what Boston Dynamics is doing, creating all these robots with DARPA contracts probably, and, you know, friends in the government. They're all one click, and they always have been. Crazy. Okay, let's continue. Unwieldy and immense, who shall hold in behemoth? Who bridle Leviathan? Flaunt it as we choose. Athwart and over the roads of our progress loom huge uncertainty and dreadful threatening gloom. It is useless to deny it. Democracy grows rankly up the thickest, noxious, deadliest plants and fruits of all. Brings worse and worse invaders, needs newer, larger, stronger, keener compensations and compellers. End quote. Wow. Now, you guys know, and I know, what he means by democracy. He means mob rule. He means, you know, majority rule. And I think he's alluding to the Civil War. Because nobody took the time to think past abolition, probably. Everybody probably just bought it up, right? Like, we bought up weapons of mass destruction. We bought up democracy in the Middle East. You know, they likely just bought it up and said, yeah, I want to be virtuous. I want to be on the right side. And that's exactly how these people operate. It's exactly how they operate. And what Whitman's saying is that if we live in a pure democracy, a Platonic or Aristotelian democracy, ancient Greek version of it, where the majority rules and the mob rules, and if you get 51% of the vote, you rule. Well, you're going to get these people at the top, the aristocracy, the Freemasons, these enlightened thinkers who are going to manipulate the public for that majority vote. And that's exactly what happens today. It's not about the truth at all. It's about convincing more than 50% of the public of your lie. And it's sick. And I think that's what Whitman's saying here, is that nobody looked past abolition to what you just did. You just unleashed Leviathan. Like, you just unleashed the beast. You opened Pandora's box by allowing these New England Freemasons to gain this much power over the Union. Because remember, before the Civil War, you had a house divided. You had a Congress split in half pretty much, right? After the war, half of that Congress is gone, and now you just have the one-sided half, just the Union half. You know what I mean? They're the ones who took over pretty much. And then after like a decade military occupation, you slowly allow the South to have representation again, but by that time, you've already done the damage. You've already created the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, right? You've already created the Harvards, the Yales, the Cambridges. It's ridiculous. I guess they were probably already there. Okay, let me get some water. There was poetic exaggeration here, and a failure to realize that the evils complained of were common to mankind, not unique to America. Yet years later, Justice Harlan of the Supreme Court, looking back upon this period, remembered that, quote, "There was everywhere among the people, generally, a deep feeling of unrest. The nation had been rid of human slavery, but the conviction was universal that the country was in real danger from another kind of slavery, namely the slavery that would result from aggregations of capital in the hands of a few." End quote. Yo, Harlan, my dude. A universal deep feeling of unrest the country had because they knew now everybody is heading into a different form of slavery, the plantation of the future. The major objectives of the war then had been achieved, but only in a partial and inconclusive manner, and the post-Civil War generation was to learn what our own generation has learned, that war always creates as many problems as it solves. The cost, too, had been colossal, though Lincoln alone of the statesmen of that day seems to have realized how great it was and how hard its payment. "Fondly do we hope," he had said, "fervently do we pray that this mighty scourge of war may speedily pass away, yet if God wills that it continue until all the wealth piled by the bondsman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn with a lash shall be paid by another, drawn by the sword." It's confusing. "As was said 3,000 years ago, so still it must be said." Yeah. All I know is that Lincoln's wife did seances in the White House. It is impossible now to compute the exactness, the cost of the Civil War, but Lincoln's tragic fears were fulfilled. Deaths from all causes in the Union Army totaled some 360,000, and in the Confederate Army, some 260,000. The number of wounded who recovered was far larger, but no reliable figures have ever been compiled. How many lives were lost because of malnutrition, disease, and the chaotic conditions of 1865 and 1866? Chaotic conditions, do you understand what that means? Military occupation, rape, pillage, murder, complete authoritarianism by an unrestrained, crazy army that was just put through a psychotic whirlwind. It's a great idea. Let's continue. "It is impossible to say, nor can we count, the cost in lives shattered by destruction and demoralized by defeat. The money cost of the war was staggering, proportionally higher, indeed, than the money cost of World War I. Loans and taxes raised by the federal government came to a little less than $3 billion, and the interest on the Civil War debt came to an additional $2.8 billion. $5.8 billion in loans and taxes. Oh my goodness. Remember when we talked about Hamilton the last episode, he talked about creating money out of debt? War is a racket. Smedley Butler's right. War is a racket. And in the Civil War, just like every war, the racket paid off huge for the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Rockefellers, and the people that have created 20th century America. The society we live in today. Crazy, dude. The Confederacy floated loans of over $2 billion, but the total financial loss of the South in property confiscated, depreciated, and destroyed, in the losses of banks and insurance companies and businesses, and in the expense of Reconstruction was incalculable. So they did to us what they did to Germany after World War I. That's what they did to the South. They Versailles Treaty'd them. They put them into an incalculable debt. Oh, man, that's sad. I think, guys, if the Confederacy had won, more people would be free today. More people would be spiritual. More people would be happy. And I think America would be a way, way greater country. I believe that with my heart. I think we got tricked by the devil. Just like maybe we got tricked with 17. Dude, the devil comes in like that, bro. The devil's nuts. The devil's nuts. Abolition was the devil tricking us into all signing our souls away to financial slavery. That's what abolition was. That's crazy, dude. My mind's blown right now. Unbelievable. Okay. The fall of the Confederacy dealt an extremely heavy blow to the planter and political aristocracy that had guided the destinies of the South since the days of Thomas Jefferson. That's a sad sentence. It killed Jeffersonianism. Killed the Jeffersonian movement, which was all about... Thomas Jefferson wrote that every man should be created equal, right? Or is created equal. So don't fall into the slavery trap. Think of what he really stood for. He stood for a society without giant dark factories and polluted cities. He stood for a society that, worshipped God's creation, worshipped the land and respected the land and lived with the land. Jefferson was way cooler, dude. Way cooler. So when the Confederacy fell, that portion of Congress died. That portion of the government died. That 1776 don't tread on me part of the government, gone. That's why we don't have it anymore, and we haven't since. Because after the Civil War, it was gone. They went up against the cabal, I think, the Confederacy. Let's continue. A large part of this class was excluded for some years from participation in the government, and for some of the abler leaders such as Davis and Lee, the disability was never removed. So they weren't even allowed back in government after the war for quite some time. Slave property valued in 1860 at over $2 billion evaporated, and the savings and sacrifices represented by Confederate securities were lost. A labor system which was the very basis of Southern economy was overthrown. The agricultural regime which it served was disarranged, and a new system, no less wasteful and scarcely less oppressive, was established in its stead. Yeah, Professor D taught us that. She said that the whole sharecropping thing, they literally just went back to slavery. Like, calling sharecropping not slavery is a joke. That's what they did during the military occupation. They just put everybody back on plantations under the government's boot. They just got FEMA camped, white and black. Everybody. Everybody in the South got FEMA camped after the Civil War. 100%. Wow. The old planter aristocracy had suffered in the war more severely than any other group. For if the war had been a poor man's fight, the poor white had nothing to lose, and his condition was no worse in 1870 than it had been in 1850. But the planters lost not only their youth, but often their means of recuperation. The blows of Reconstruction, as staggering as those of defeat. Think about what he just said. What they did to the South during Reconstruction was just as bad as what they did during the war, is what this author's saying. It wasted those impalpable moral values which had been accumulated during a century or more of stewardship. They killed the spirit. They killed the religious founded spirit of the South, Jeffersonian spirit. Wow. Well, they learned what the Knights of Aristophanes declared 24 centuries ago, quote, "There are things, then, hotter than fire. There are speeches more shameless still than the shameless speeches of those who rule the city at will," end quote. Goddamn Yankees. Many gave up the struggle to maintain themselves on the land. A few fled to England, Mexico, or Brazil. Others migrated to the northern cities or started life anew in the West. Many moved to the towns and adapted themselves to business and professional life. At the same time, the small farmers and poor whites took advantage of the prevailing disorder to enlarge their farms, better their conditions, and elect men of their own kind, who shared, instead of scorning their prejudices to high office, a little while, and the Tillmans, Watsons, and Rankins would sit in the seats of the Calhouns, Cobbs, and the Clays. The most clean-cut stroke of the Revolution in the South was the emancipation of 4 million Negro slaves. This process of emancipation had begun during the war. It was consummated by 3 amendments to the Constitution. Okay, listen up, 1619 Project. Listen up, lefties. This part's important for you. The 13th, ratified in 1865, abolished slavery in places not reached by the Emancipation Proclamation. The 14th Amendment extended federal protection to the freedmen for their personal and property rights, and the 15th Amendment attempted to assure them the franchise. The bottom rail was on top. In the salty phrase of all time, but the whites did not let it stay there long. While the old pattern of Southern society and economy was being rearranged, and I said that because BLM talks about the 13th Amendment or something. They just completely made up some like crazy thing about the 13th Amendment to try and get it removed, I think. I can't remember. While the old pattern of Southern society and economy was being rearranged into a new one, a corresponding revolution was effected in the North. With the representatives of the planter class out of Congress, the spokesmen of industry, finance, and free Western lands were unopposed, unless by one another. During the war, they pushed through legislation to fulfill the arrested hopes of the 50s, and after victory, they garnered the fruits thereof. The moderate tariff of 1857 gave way to the moral tariff of 1861, and that to a series of war tariffs with duties scaling rapidly upward, and carefully adapted to meet the need and greed of northern business. By the National Banking Acts of 1863 and 64, the independent treasury system of 1846 was swept away in favor of one more attractive to private finance, and an act of 1865 imposed a tax on 10% on all state bank notes, a fatal blow which none would regret. The money question, which long agitated American politics, was settled as the financial interest of the East wished. By the rejection of greenback inflation, the resumption of specie payments, and eventually by the establishment of the gold standard, that there might be no shortage of labor, Congress in 1864 permitted the importation of contract labor from abroad. And though this act was repealed within a few years, the practice itself was not discontinued until the decade of the 80s. At the same time, the policy of internal improvements at national expense found expression in subsidies to telegraph and cable lines and generous grants of millions of acres out of the public domain to railroad promoters and financiers. While northern industry and finance were reaping the fruits of loyalty and victory, the century-old ambition of western farmers was ostensibly satisfied by the passage of the Homestead Law in 1862. This act, limited temporarily in its application to those who have never borne arms against the United States government, granted a quarter section, 160 acres, of public domain to anyone who would undertake to cultivate it. The Morrill Act, passed the same year, subsidized agricultural education through public lands. At the same time, easier access to the West assured through the government-subsidized railroads. This legislation carried out the promise of the Republican Party platform and helped bring to that party support from the agricultural West. So they're always so kind, using the people to go settle the land, right? But meanwhile, they're up until the 1880s, they're still bringing slaves in pretty much. It's ridiculous, dude. They fight for abolition, but at the same time, they have Chinese slaves building the railroads. It's ridiculous. They have kids, working in coal mines. Unbelievable. In order to secure this body of legislation and the support of those who benefited from it, the Republican Party managed to throw about its constitutional guarantees. The 14th Amendment, originally designed to protect the freedmen, with its provision that no state could deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, was used to protect business interests from state regulation, and taught those interests to look to the federal government and the Republican Party for protection. Wow. So there was, it seems, a good Republican Party, the John Quincy Adams Republican Party of the anti-Freemason Republican Party. That seemed like a real political party, but it seems like all the things they did during the Civil War, because they were still functioning, the Union, all the stuff they passed was to benefit the wealth and the aristocracy of the Northeast. And they even used the 14th Amendment as a way to protect business interests. And that's going to be important when we talk about the Act of 1871, because a corporation has similar rights as a person. Yeah, that's what they mean when they say that. When they say they appealed to the Republican Party for protection and used the 14th Amendment to protect their business interests from state regulation, Yeah. So we're gonna be talking about that in a little bit. But yeah, during the Civil War, it seems like the Republican Party became infiltrated because now the people who are getting all the money are the ones that are members of Freemasonry, are the ones that are members of the aristocracy, are the ones at the colleges, and the ones that are Hamiltonians. So they literally use, the people, the free market. They'll go give you 160 acres, but they're doing that because they have a different agenda, and that agenda is control. And we live in that successful agenda. It's crazy, dude. Okay. Let's see here. The war then developed the revolution in industry, transportation, and finance that was already underway, and strengthened the political party which came to be committed to these interests. Most of this development might have come about eventually by peaceful means, but the war accelerated the process and gave to it a drastic character. Industrial America, Alexander Hamilton's embodied vision, wow, look at that, what'd I just say? Hamilton's embodied vision swaggered in under the cloak of patriotism with the bayonet as a substitute for the slow process of education and economic revolution. Wow. How great of a sentence, gang, huh? Alexander Hamilton's embodied vision swaggered in under the cloak of patriotism with the bayonet as a substitute for the slow process of education and economic revolution. And how do they swagger in their globalist agenda today? Well, they quite literally do it through the music industry. Swag. They mock you. They mock me. Ugh. All right, the prostrate South. Physical devastation without parallel until 1914 through 18, World War I, preceded the social and economic revolution in the South. Over large sections of the country, Union and Confederate armies had trampled and fought, and parts of Virginia, Tennessee, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and Arkansas had the appearance of enormous battlefields. Think about that. While I get a sip of water, think about that. American cities looking like World War I battlefields. Okay. Sherman had left a broad belt of blackened ruin from Atlanta to Savannah, and from Savannah to Raleigh. Where our footsteps pass, wrote one of its aides, fire, ashes, and desolation follow in the path. From Fairfax Courthouse to Petersburg, the region was such a wilderness that nature came back and deer ran wild in the forest. Sheridan had swept down the fertile Shenandoah Valley like an avenging fury, leaving a trail of wreckage and ruin. We had no cattle, hogs, sheep, or horses, or anything else, wrote a native of Virginia. The fences were all gone. The barns were all burned, chimneys standing without houses, and houses standing without roofs or doors or windows. Bridges all destroyed, roads badly cut up. In the west, conditions were just as bad. The Tennessee Valley, wrote Robert Somers, an English observer, consists for the most part of plantations in a state of semi-decay, and plantations of which the ruin is total and complete. The governor of Arkansas wrote of his state, the desolation of war is beyond description. Besides the utter desolation that marked the tracks of war and battle, guerrilla bands and scouting parties have pillaged almost every neighborhood. It would be safe to say that 2/3 of the counties in the state are in destitute circumstances. Holy crap. You know what that reminds me of? Remember in Chicago when the aldermen, which is like a neighborhood government position, they were, all 50 of them were on a call with Mayor Lori Lightfoot during the riots. That weekend, like 100 people were shot. And what we just read was basically exactly what one of those aldermen said. That was crazy, dude. The governor of Arkansas wrote of his state, the desolations of war are beyond description. Besides the utter desolation that marked the tracks of war and battle, guerrilla bands and scouting parties have pillaged almost every neighborhood. It would be safe to say that 2/3 of the counties in the state are in destitute circumstances. That's literally what that guy says. He's like, I've got people with AK-47s walking around in my neighborhood. It's these same people at play. Back then they were Republicans. Today they're Democrats. Party name doesn't matter. They're in both parties. It's ridiculous. Some of the cities presented a picture as appalling as the rural regions. Charleston, once the proudest city of the South, had been bombarded and partially burned. A northern visitor painted it as a city of vacant houses, of widowed women and rotting wharves, of deserted warehouses and weed-wild gardens, of miles of grass-grown streets, of acres of pitiful and voiceless barrenness. Of Richmond, the capital of the Confederacy, we read, all up and down as far as the eye could reach, the business portion of the city lay in ruins. Beds of cinders, cellars half filled with bricks and rubbish, broken and blackened walls, impassable streets, deluged with debris. In Atlanta, Sidney Andrews found masses of brick and mortar, charred timber, scraps of tin roofing, engine bolts and bars, cannonballs and long-shot filling. The ruined streets of Mobile, Galveston, Vicksburg, and numerous other cities of the South were a similar plight. With the collapse of the Confederacy, civil government and administration all but disappeared throughout the South. There was no money for the support of government and no authority which could assess or collect taxes. The Postal Service was paralyzed, and it was fully 2 years before normal service was restored. There were no courts, no judges, no sheriffs, no police officers with any authority, and vandalism went unrestrained except by public opinion or by lynch law. Our principal danger, observed George Gary Eggleston, was from lawless bands of marauders who infested the country, and our greatest difficulty in dealing with them lay in the utter absence of constituted authority of any sort. This is what the North did. And lynch law, too. So it didn't only apply to black people, right? It's important to know that. Yes, there were racial lynchings, of course, but there were lynchings of all criminals because the North completely destroyed the government and didn't do anything about it. So that I'd imagine the lynching that lasted until the 20th century probably stemmed out of lynch law from those crazy years, not from racism only. The United States Treasury agents seized hundreds of thousands of bales of cotton and other property as well. Agents frequently received or collected property which the law did not authorize them to take, admitted Secretary McCulloch. Lawless men singly and organized bands engaged in general plunder. Every species of intrigue and speculation and theft was resorted to. No less than 40,000 claimants were subsequently reimbursed by the federal government because of illegal confiscation of their property. The economic life of the South was shattered, and even agriculture was slow to revive. Alabama produced 1 million bales of cotton in 1860 and only 500,000 in 1870. Mississippi produced 1.2 million bales in 1860 and 500,000 in 1870. Not until 1879 did the seceding states produce a cotton crop as large as that of 1860. The rice industry of South Carolina and Georgia all but disappeared, and so too the sugarcane industry of Louisiana. In 1870, the tobacco crop of Virginia was 1/3 of that of 1860, and the corn and wheat crop 1/2. Between 1860 and 70, the total value of farm property in the seceding state declined 48%. All of these numbers are so important because that's how they forced everybody to go north, right? That literally, they treated the Confederacy the same way they treat the people of the Middle East today. Same playbook. Pretty much. Occupation, pillaging, plundering, destruction, forcing your will on them. What they're forcing is different, but in this case, they're forcing their will upon the people of the South, and they're putting them in a situation where they have to rely on the northern aristocracy, the northern industrious, industrial people. Wow, that's really sad. The transportation system of the region was in a state of collapse. Roads were all but impassable, bridges destroyed or washed away, ditches filled in, river levees broken. What steamboats had not been captured or destroyed were in a state of disrepair. Railroad transportation was paralyzed, and most of the railroad companies bankrupt. Over a stretch of 114 miles of railroad in Alabama. Wonder why they all were bankrupt? Well, we know why. It's these barons in the Northeast. Every bridge and trestle was destroyed, cross tiers rotten, buildings burned, water tanks gone, ditches filled up, and tracks grown up in the weeds and bushes. A similar story could be told for the railroads of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia. Except in Texas, public lands were not made available for Southern railway construction, and the railroad system of the South was not properly restored for almost a generation. Listen here, very important, guys. Starvation was imminent in certain sections. In Richmond, half of the population was dependent upon government rations, doled out by federal relief. In Columbia, 10,000 people were fed by the Army, and at Atlanta, the Army commissary distributed food to 50,000, needy whites and blacks of the surrounding territory. The Negroes suffered most, being less able to adjust themselves to the new situation. The Freedmen's Bureau other northern relief agencies did what they could to alleviate the suffering, but as late as December 1865, it was estimated that in Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, there were over 500,000 people without the necessities of life. Of course, they put the racial line in there. They always have to, but everybody suffered. Social disorganization was scarcely less complete. Much of the educational system of the South had been deranged. Schools were closed, pupils and teachers scattered. School funds had been used up in the war. Endowments for colleges and universities squandered or confiscated. Churches had been destroyed and church money dissipated. Young men of family who had interrupted their education to fight for Southern independence had to labor in the fields to keep their families from starving, and a planter's family which still had young men was deemed fortunate. 70-year-old Thomas Dabney, once a proud Mississippi planter, did the family wash for years after the war. General Pendleton plowed his few acres, and General Anderson worked as a day laborer in the yards of the South Carolina Railroad. George Fitzhugh, the philosopher of slavery, who had lectured at Harvard and Yale, lived in a poor shanty among his former slaves. William Gilmore Simms, the South's leading man of letters, lost not only his house, stables, barn, gin house, machine, and threshing houses, mules, horses, cattle, wagons, plows, implements, all destroyed, but what was probably the finest private library in the South. Pretty much the whole of life had been merely not dying, wrote the Southern poet Sidney Lanier. Wow. So you can see here that we're really getting ordo ab cow. That's what the North did. Yeah. The Freemasonic controlled North straight up just order out of chaos half the country. That's basically what happened. Absolutely insane. That's nuts, dude. Let's see what we got next. Might go to the computer next. All right, I got one more paper book. Okay, we're going to read from one more book, and then we're going to get to some computer sources, and we're going to get into the John Wilkes Booth bloodline, which will be really fun. Sources of the American Republic. Let's see where this book came from. Looks like a school book. It says property of Tohoto Regional High School. Cool. Volume 2. Published by Chicago, Atlanta, Scott Forsman and Company. 19... somewhere, hold on. I can't find it. Anyway, it's old. It's an old one. So we're going to be reading A Southern View, and I'll read you the title of what this is. It's got really small words. Hold on. Is the camera out of focus? There we go. Okay, it's from James D.B. DeBow. Testimony before a subcommittee of the Joint Committee on Reconstruction, March 28th, 1866. Wow, so right after the war. And here's a little intro written by the author of the textbook. The South in 1865 had to come to grips with military defeat, with political subordination, with grinding poverty, and with the social revolution affected by the abolition of slavery. There is no more fascinating social record in American history than the 3 large volumes of testimony on Southern conditions gathered by congressional investigators in 1865 to 66. Union officers, Freedmen's Bureau agents, travelers, and a handful of freedmen, chiefly Union witnesses, supplied the bulk of evidence. In a few instances, leading Southerners gave their views, notable among them James D.B. DeBow, 1820 to 1867. Before the war, DeBow had made his Commercial Review of the South and Southwest, published at New Orleans, the most widely read of Southern magazines and a leading source of fact and opinion on economic affairs. Increasingly in the 1850s, DeBow became an aggressive advocate for pro-slavery views in a great national debate. DeBow's testimony before the Joint Congressional Committee represented the opinions of many reputable ex-Confederates. They could not and would not renounce their past beliefs in the justice of the Confederate cause and of slavery. Let me interject real quick. Remember, 75% didn't own slaves. Of the 25% that did own slaves, 95% had 2 or less. Remember, it's all about the slavery agenda. That's the whole crux holding this, great historical misunderstanding together. Let's continue. But they did accept the inevitable consequences of defeat. They were at best skeptical of the Negro's capacity to become a full citizen and not much interested in efforts to advance former slaves in the path of literacy and economic independence. They believed that the Southern states should be restored to their old place in the Union under the direction of their former leaders. That contradicts what we read in Louis Hughes' journal, his diary. Louis Hughes, a slave, he knew how to read. He knew how to swindle. He was making $1,600 a week with one of the white dudes there selling tobacco plugs. So like they want you to think every Southerner was racist. They want you to think that black and whites didn't intermingle at all. But that's just not true. There was a very small class of people that, used slaves as their ways, as a means for their whole family. These plantation owners, this aristocracy, right? But the vast majority of the South were fighting for freedom. They were fighting for Jeffersonian ideals. They were fighting because the Freemasons in the North were clearly pushing some agendas. Big money agendas. Big government agendas. That's what they were fighting against. The South was fighting against big government, big money. Okay. They believed that the Southern states should be restored to their old place in the Union under the direction of their former leaders. Such views as these gave little reassurance to the triumphant Republicans of the North, whose ideals and hatreds, economic interest, and party ambitions all led them to demand a new order in the South. One that would displace the old regime of planter leadership, white domination, Democrat Party allegiance, state rights doctrine, and agrarian economic policy. Interesting. So in some aspects, the Democrats and Republicans did switch. It doesn't justify the big switch, as they call it in the mainstream, but in some ways, yeah, they did switch a little bit. The Democrats have become the big government, big money party. So are Republicans. They all suck. They all have been subverted so many times. Trash. Okay, let's read from the actual testimony. Here's the question. So this is the questions Congress asked. State if you have been at any time since the cessation of hostilities in the state of Louisiana, and if so, how long, and what opportunities you have had to ascertain the temper and disposition of the people towards the general government. Answer. I spent 5 or 6 weeks of the present year in Louisiana, and was in intimate association with the citizens there of all classes. I am a resident of that state, and of course largely acquainted, and having been absent during the war after the surrender of the city, I met a great many of people on my return. I have also just returned from a general tour at the South. Question. What are the views and feelings of the people there as to the late war and its results, and as to the future condition of the state and its relations to the federal government? Answer. There seems to be a general, you may say universal, acquiescence in the results. There is a great deal of dissatisfaction as to the course in reference to their condition pursued by the federal government. I think the people, having fairly tried the experiment of secession, are perfectly satisfied with the result, and that there is no disposition in any quarter, in any shape or form, to embarrass the United States government, or to refrain from the most complete performance of all duties of citizenship. I saw nothing of that sort. All parties, those who were opposed to the war and those who were in favor of the war, are now agreed that it is for the best interest of the state to perform all the duties of citizenship and to accept whatever the government has effected in reference to the Negro, as well as in reference to other questions. Do you guys get the feeling that, I didn't read this before, do you get the feeling that this guy might not represent the South? He might just be, like I said, half of the government seceded and was defeated at war. So the only part of the government remaining was the other half, the Northern Republican, globalist, central bank, big government half. So I question this deeply. Let's see what else we got in here. Let's see. Okay, Bull, Bear and Company, the Robber Barons. Let's see. This is from Charles Francis Adams, A Chapter of Erie, 1869. So 4 years after the war. Excuse me. And it's in a section called New Masters of Capital. The westward expansion of the United States and the development of the country's vast agricultural and industrial resources depended upon the free flow of commerce. In the first half of the 19th century, turnpikes, canals, and natural waterways provided essential transportation channels for Americans. Told you guys that. But by 1860, it was clear that the future lay with the railroad, a fast and flexible carrier of men, raw materials, and manufactures. The railroad business promised rich prizes to the question of relentless empire builders who dominated American life in the post-war years. Bold statement. Empire builders, that's who dominated America after the war. The man who controlled a great railroad system could, in the language of Charles Francis Adams Jr., levy his tolls on the traffic of a continent. Think about that, dude. And we just accept it. We just accept tolls. It's ridiculous. Whoever owns the railroad gets to toll the whole country. That's what that just said. It's great. It's exactly what they do today. And then some. Hold on here. Oh, here we go. Cornelius Vanderbilt, who made his first business success in river and coastal shipping before the war, built a fortune estimated at over $100 million by consolidating a series of short railroad lines into the New York Central system. The Central carried through traffic from New York to Chicago via Cleveland, later reaching out to Detroit, Boston, St. Louis, and Montreal. The Commodore, as he was called, combined the worst and best traits of the robber barons of that age. He was a fierce, unscrupulous competitor who did not hesitate to use his wealth and power to bribe legislators and manage judges. What do we read in the anti-Masonic proceedings? So 40 years before this, what we're reading, in the 1830s, John Quincy Adams and friends created the anti-Masonic Republican Party, exposing just this, exposing the connections between the press and the government and business. And it's just by the end of that war, it seems like that spirit died. The anti-Masonic Republican Party, the spirit they had was carried by the Southern Democrats, the Confederacy, and then it was ultimately destroyed after the globalist Republican infiltrated party of the North took out the Jeffersonian Democrats of the South. We're going to have to make a map for this. Okay, but yeah, they're talking about Cornelius Vanderbilt and how he bribes legislators and managed judges. Yet he proved a creative enterpriser and sound railroad manager whose central system helped to satisfy the community's insistent demand for faster, cheaper, safer, more efficient transportation services. This is the intro, by the way. The consolidation of railroad ownership and control in a period of tremendous growth could serve a variety of purposes. The unified railroad system offered to men like Vanderbilt the efficiencies of large-scale operation and a way of checking ruinous rate wars. Wow, they're trying to justify it. Okay. To not a few of the robber barons, however, consolidation provided primarily the chance to make a fortune by stock manipulations, without regard to the interest of the corporation or the community. When Vanderbilt, in 1868, set out to capture control of the Erie Railway, chief rival of his New York Central line, for the traffic between New York and the Great Lakes region, he met his match in a gang of Wall Street's sharpest operators, the veteran speculative director of the Erie Corporation, Daniel Drew, and his rising young associates, Jay Gould and... who's the other one? Jim Fisk. Hold on, let me get this in the light. Vanderbilt threw his millions into the market to corner Erie stock. Drew and his Wall Street allies gladly received the Commodore's money. Their press could print new shares of Erie faster than Vanderbilt could absorb them. Each side employed its pocket judges to restrain and harass the enemy. State legislators at Albany sold their votes to Drew or Vanderbilt agents, sometimes to both, at the going price of $15,000. It's ridiculous, dude. Ridiculous. They were doing it right after the war. And when I show you a photographic tour of Portland, all the brick and granite buildings, all the infrastructure that survived to this day, all the solid city buildings were made between 1865 and like 1879. They were all post-war, boom, Northern Freemasonic. Running out of words for them. You know what I mean, though? The people who benefited from the war built the brick New England, that we're familiar with today from the Industrial Revolution. Wow. Okay. Yeah, and clearly it says right here, judges and legislators, they just sold their votes. Gould and Fisk inherited the bankrupt railroad, but their ingenuity discovered further sources of plunder in the poor old hulk of the Erie. The nimble Gould sold out his interest in the corporation just in time to escape the inevitable bankruptcy that followed the Panic of 1873. The Erie Wars of 1868 symbolized all that was rotten in the post-war economic and political order. An upright, intelligent young writer of a distinguished Yankee line, Charles Francis Adams, great-grandson of John Adams, published his expose of the fantastic struggle of the corporate titans as a warning that great corporations and political corruption together could destroy the free republic. Oh, my heart just warmed up. Do you get the connection, guys? John Quincy Adams, descendant, is whatever, great-grandson or whatever, is writing about the corruption of corporate America post-Civil War. So the Addams family are patriots. They are thoroughbred patriots because one ancestor helps found America. Another ancestor is a founder of the anti-Masonic Republican Party. And now this ancestor, Charles Francis Adams Jr., is a writer, a news writer, writing about the political corruption that corporations and these robber barons are causing. That's awesome. What a great family. See, there are real patriots. There really are. Okay. He published his expose on this fantastic struggle of the corporate titans as a warning that great corporations and political corruption together could destroy the free republic. In 1869, Adams was appointed head of the first Railroad Regulatory Commission in the United States, established by Massachusetts. He later served as chairman of the governing directors and then as president of the Union Pacific Railroad. His work, Railroads, Their Origins and Problems, became a standard authority. Judging by the standards of the older Boston elite, Adams found the new men of power in the world of big business crude, narrow, selfish, and uninteresting at best. His later years were quietly devoted to the civic affairs of Quincy, Massachusetts, the Adams family seat, and at Harvard College, like the famous brother Henry. Charles Francis Adams Jr. was essentially an outsider in the age of Gould, Vanderbilt, Rockefeller, and Carnegie. I want to meet an Adams family member. They must be carrying on the spirit. They must be fighting. That's awesome. Okay. Now we're getting to the actual text here, which is Charles Francis Adams, and it's a chapter from the book Erie, which he wrote about this war. The enterprising citizens who originated and forced through to completion this great national work, the Erie Railway, as important in our civilization as was ever the Appian Way in that of Rome, could hardly have contemplated it as among the possibilities of the future that a band of conspirators would soon possess themselves of it and, while not only levying toll upon it for their own emolument, but through it, on the whole business of the continent, would also pervert its great resources into an engine of financial calamity and public distress. Such, however, has been the result of that revolution in the management of the road which sprung out of what are now known and will long be remembered as the Erie Wars of 1868, beginning in February and lasting until December, raging fiercely in the late winter and spring and dying away into the hollow truce at midsummer, only to revive into new and more vigorous life in the autumn. This strange conflict convulsed the money market, occupied the courts, agitated legislatures, and perplexed the country throughout the entire year. Its history has not been, and probably never will be, fully written, yet it was more than a 9 days' wonder, and the names of those who achieved notoriety or infamy in connection with it will be familiarly remembered long after those secret facts in its history, which they alone can impart, are buried with them forever. This is great. I love this. Let me get some water. It reads like the anti-Masonic papers. It's great, dude. The series of events in the Erie history which culminated in the struggle may be said to have had its origin some 17 or 18 years ago, when Mr. Daniel Drew first made his appearance in the board of directors, where he remained down to the year 1868, generally holding also the office of treasurer of the corporation. Mr. Drew is what is known as a self-made man. Born in the year 1797, as a boy he drove cattle down from his native town in Carmel, in Putnam County, to the market of New York City, and subsequently was for years proprietor of the Bull's Head Tavern, like his contemporary and ally or opponent, as the case might be. The steamboat, Cornelius Vanderbilt, he built up his fortunes in the steamboat interest. Okay, so Vanderbilt is a rival to Drew. Those are the two factions. Vanderbilt built his fortunes in the steamboat interest and subsequently extended his operation over the rapidly developing railroad system. Shrewd, unscrupulous, and very illiterate, a strange combination of superstition and faithlessness, of daring and timidity, often good-natured and sometimes generous, he has ever regarded his fiduciary position of director in a railroad as a means of manipulating its stock for his own advantage. This is Vanderbilt. He was illiterate, you guys. And it also says he was superstitious. What does that mean? That means he's part of some brotherhood, does something occult, takes part in some sort of rituals with all these crazy Hamiltonian globalists. Okay. Where'd we leave off? One moment. For years, he has been the leading bear of Wall Street, and his favorite haunts have been the secret recesses of Erie. As treasurer of that corporation, he has in its frequently recurring hours of need advanced its sums which it could not have obtained elsewhere, and the obtaining of which was a necessity. He has been at once a good friend of the road, and at worst the worst enemy it ever knew. His management of his favorite stock had been cunning and recondite, and his ways inscrutable. Those who sought to follow him and those who sought to oppose him alike found food for sad reflection, until at last he won for himself the expressive sobriquet of the speculative director. Sometimes, though rarely, he suffered greatly in the complications of Wall Street. More frequently, he inflicted severe damage upon others. On the whole, however, his fortunes had greatly prospered, and the outbreak of the Erie War found him the actual possessor of some millions, and the reputed possessor of many more. Great events were impending. A new man was looming up in the railroad world, introducing novel ideas and principles, and it could hardly be that the new and old would not come in conflict. Cornelius Vanderbilt, commonly known as Commodore Vanderbilt, was now developing his theory of the management of railroads. Oh boy. Let's see if we can skip ahead. Let's see what he does for a conclusion. Things were very wordy back then, but I like that. Okay. One leading feature of these developments, however, is from its political aspect, especially worthy of the attention of the American people. Modern society has created... Oh gosh, listen to this, you guys. This is going to be beautiful. Modern society has created a class of artificial beings who bid fair soon to be the masters of their creator. It is but a very few years since the existence of a corporation controlling a few millions of dollars was regarded as a subject of grave apprehension, and now this country already contains single organizations which wield a power represented by hundreds of millions. These bodies are the creatures of single states, but in New York, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and not in those states alone, they are already establishing despotisms which no spasmody popular effort will be able to shake off. Holy crap. I haven't read this. Everywhere and at all times, however, they illustrate the truth of the old maxim of the common law, that corporations have no souls. Only in New York has any imitation yet been given of what the future may have in store for us, should these great powers become mere tools in the hands of ambitious, reckless men. The system of corporate life and corporate power as applied to industrial development is yet in its infancy. It tends always to development, always to consolidation. It is ever grasping new powers for insidiously exercising covert influence. Even now, the system threatens a central government. Oh my gosh! Holy crap. Pause. This was written in 1868 by Charles Adams. What happens in 1871? DC is incorporated. They incorporate the federal government. Oh my goodness. And he warns about it. The system of corporate life and corporate power as applied to industrial development is yet in its infancy. It tends always to development, always to consolidation. It is ever grasping new powers or insidiously exercising covert influence. Even now, the system threatens the central government. Wow, you guys. At the 2-hour mark. Remember that. That's crazy. The Erie Railway represents a weak combination compared to those which day by day are consolidating under the unsuspecting eyes of the community. A very few years more, and we shall see corporations as much exceeding the Erie and the New York Central in both ability and will for corruption as they will exceed those roads in wealth and in length of iron track. We shall see these great corporations spanning the continent from ocean to ocean, single, consolidated lines, not connecting Albany with Buffalo or Lake Erie with Hudson, but uniting the Atlantic and the Pacific, and bringing New York nearer to San Francisco than Albany once was to Buffalo. Already the discontented members of these future Leviathans have built up states in the wilderness and chosen their attorneys senators of the United States. Now their power in its infancy. In a very few years they will reenact on a larger theater and on a grander scale, with every feature magnified, the scenes which were lately witnessed on the narrow stage of a single state. The public corruption is the foundation of which corporations always depend for their political power. There is a natural tendency to coalition between them and the lowest strata of political intelligence and morality. For their agents must obey, not question. They exact success and do not cultivate political morality. The lobby is their home, and the lobby thrives as political virtue decays. The ring is their symbol of power, and the ring is the natural enemy of political purity and independence. All this was abundantly illustrated in the events which have just been narrated. The existing coalition between the Erie Railway and the Tammany Ring is a natural one, and the former needs votes, the latter money. This combination now controls the legislature and courts of New York, that it controls also the executive of the state as well as that of the city, and proved when Governor Hoffman recorded his reasons for signing the infamous Erie Directors Bill. It is a new power for which our language contains no name. We know what autocracy, this is incredible, democracy are, but we have no word to express government by moneyed corporations. The next step will be interesting, as the Erie Ring represents the combination of the corporation and the hired proletariat of the great city. As Vanderbilt embodied the autocratic power of Caesarism introduced into corporate life, and as neither alone can obtain complete control of the government of the state, it perhaps only remains for the coming man to carry the combination of elements one step in advance and put Caesarism at once in control of the corruption and of the proletariat, to bring our vaunted institutions within the rule of all historic precedent. That was my favorite part of the whole episode. Wow. He totally just predicts now. That's insane. I can't believe that. I gotta bookmark that. That was incredible. Woo! Well, we're at 2 hours, so we're going to stop, and then when I come back, we're going to start with the Act of 1871. So I will see you guys most likely tomorrow.
Soldiers, sailors, and airmen of the Allied Expeditionary Force, you are about to embark upon the great crusade toward which we have striven these many months. The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere march with you. In company with our brave allies and brothers in arms on other fronts, you will bring about the destruction of the German war machine, the elimination of Nazi tyranny over the oppressed peoples of Europe, and security for ourselves in a free world. Your task will not be an easy one. Your enemy is well-trained, well-equipped, and battle-hardened. He will fight savagely. But this is the year 1944. Much has happened since the Nazi triumphs of 1940-41. The United Nations have inflicted upon the Germans great defeats in open battle, man to man. Our air offensive has seriously reduced their strength in the air and their capacity to wage war on the ground. Our home fronts have given us an overwhelming superiority in weapons and munitions of war, and placed at our disposal great reserves of trained fighting men. The tide has turned. The free men of the world are marching together to victory. I have full confidence in your courage, devotion to duty, and skill in battle. We will accept nothing less than full victory. Good luck, and let us all beseech the blessing of Almighty God upon this great and noble undertaking.